Dr. Elias Vance believed the WOW signal was humanity's first hello from the stars. He was wrong. After 48 years of silence, his quantum algorithm finally decoded the message. It wasn't a greeting. It was a blueprint, and when he built the device and heard what was really out there, he discovered the terrifying truth. We've never been alone. We've been livestock. The cosmic consciousness that's been shaping human history for millennia knows he's listening, and it's coming for him. The third-floor lab of the physics building had long since surrendered to the night. Its authorized occupants were home, sleeping the dreamless sleep of the tenured. But here, in this forgotten annex cluttered with decommissioned hardware, Dr. Elias Vance was wide awake. He had been awake for 37 hours. The lab, his lab, was a testament to this fact. It was a chaotic nest woven from Ethernet cables and power cords, dotted with the fossilized remains of long-dead takeout meals. Elias himself was a creature of this environment. At 32, he had the gaunt, laser-focused intensity of a man who had traded worldly comforts for a single, all-consuming idea. He stared, unblinking, at the central monitor where a quantum waveform spun like a captured ghost. It was a visual representation of his life's work, an algorithm he'd christened echo decay. Filter for carrier wave collapse, he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. His fingers danced across the keyboard, the clicks echoing in the tomb-like silence. Amplitude declination has to be the key. The books piled precariously on every flat surface were his silent congregation. Texts on quantum entanglement, advanced signal processing, Fourier analysis. Leaning against a stack of printouts was a small, framed photo of a young Carl Sagan, his gaze directed upward, a patron saint of hopeful curiosity. But Elias' work wasn't hopeful. It was obsessive. He was a digital necromancer, trying to raise a ghost from a 48-year-old corpse of data. The academic community called his work a waste of resources. His department head called it career suicide. Elias called it the only thing that mattered. He believed, with the unwavering faith of a zealot, that the WOW signal of 1977 wasn't just a stray radio burst. He believed it was a message, but one so complex, so dense, that it had been mistaken for noise. A message encrypted, not with conventional mathematics, but with the very laws of quantum physics. Echo decay was the key, the Rosetta Stone he had built from scratch, and tonight it was finally ready. With a final, decisive keystroke, Elias initiated the run. A progress bar appeared at the bottom of the screen. Whoa. The server fans whirred to life, a rising hum that was the only other presence in the room. On a small secondary monitor, a documentary he'd been watching for inspiration played on a silent loop. The archival footage, grainy and washed out, showed a different time, a different kind of science. It was August 15th, 1977. The Big Ear radio telescope in Ohio. A young astronomer named Jerry Eman was staring at a sheet of computer printout, his eyes wide with a joy so pure it felt like a relic from another species. He excitedly grabbed a red pen and circled a sequence of alphanumeric characters, 6EQJ5. He scribbled a single word in the margin, WOW. The contrast was a chasm. Eman's discovery was tangible, a burst of ink on paper, a moment of raw, human astonishment. Elias' hunt was sterile, abstract, a search for a pattern within a trillion points of silent data. Eman had looked up at the stars with wonder. Elias was staring into the guts of a machine, demanding an answer. The progress bar crawled. 20, 43. The hum of the servers deepened. Elias' heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. Years of ridicule, of late nights fueled by stale coffee and stubborn pride, all came down to this. 78. 91. He leaned forward, his face inches from the screen, his breath fogging a small patch of the glass. 99. A quiet, final chime echoed through the lab, The progress bar vanished. The process was complete. Kalen's entire body tensed, bracing for the vindication he so desperately craved. He was expecting text, a sentence, a formula, a string of prime numbers, anything to prove he wasn't a fool. The screen flickered, then resolved. But there was no text. There was no message. Instead, what bloomed into existence was a schematic, a blueprint of impossible complexity, layered like a ghostly onion, shimmering with intricate lines and geometries that seemed to defy conventional space. It was stunningly beautiful, and it was utterly, incomprehensibly wrong. For a long moment, Kalen just stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The vindication he'd expected curdled into confusion, then soured into a hot, bitter rage. He slammed his fist on the desk, rattling the monitor. Gibberish, he snarled at the silent room. It's a recursive error, a feedback loop, a fractal ghost in the machine. He tore his eyes from the impossible image and began frantically running diagnostics, his face a mask of bitter disappointment. His algorithm had worked, but it had produced a fantasy. He was a failure. The ghost he had raised was just a glitch, a beautiful, meaningless phantom born of flawed code. Hours bled into one another. The anger subsided, leaving behind the cold, grey ash of exhaustion. But something kept Kalen at his desk. He hadn't found a single error in his code. The algorithm was sound. The output, however anomalous, was valid. Defeated but methodical, he returned to the schematic, not as a hopeful discoverer, but as a debugger, determined to find the flaw in its logic. He zoomed in, pushing deep into one of the layers. The lines resolved into finer and finer detail. And then he saw them, annotations. Not in English, not in any language he could recognize. They were written in the only truly universal tongue, pure mathematics. He saw the fine structure constant used as a unit of length. He saw the Planck length defining a tolerance. He saw the charge of a single electron used as a power rating. A cold dread, colder than his disappointment had ever been, began to creep up his spine. This wasn't a glitch. A glitch was random. This was precise. This was intentional. The realization dawned not like a sunrise, but like the slow, terrifying eclipse of everything he thought he knew. This wasn't a graphical error. This was a hyper-efficient, data-compressed blueprint for a physical device. The awe returned, but this time it was laced with a profound terror. His breath hitched. He reached out a trembling hand and traced one of the glowing lines on the screen, a connection between two components he couldn't possibly name. The wow signal wasn't a hello. It wasn't a greeting. It was a set of instructions. And for 48 years, they had been waiting for someone to read them. The terror of the discovery did not fade. It simply changed shape. It solidified from a paralyzing awe into a frantic, feverish purpose. Elias Vance, the data scientist, was dead. In his place was Elias Vance, the builder, the sole interpreter of an alien gospel written in the language of physics. The blueprint on his tablet became his holy text, and his small apartment transformed into a workshop, a sanctuary of obsession. His days became a blur of motion. The camera of his life cut rapidly from one strange task to the next. Here he was in a dusty electronic surplus store, the air thick with the smell of ozone and decay, haggling with the proprietor over a set of vacuum tubes that hadn't been manufactured in 50 years. Here he was in the university engineering lab, long after midnight, the lone figure illuminated by the glow of a 3D printer as it whined, meticulously tracing the path of a non-Euclidean component, a shape that seemed to twist the very air around it. Here he was at a municipal scrapyard, his face streaked with grime, pulling a specific gauge of superconductive copper wiring from the guts of a wrecked MRI machine, the security guard watching him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Back in his apartment, the project grew. He soldered connections with a surgeon's precision, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes. The blueprint glowed from his tablet, its ethereal light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, making it seem as though the room itself was filled with ghosts. His scientific knowledge, once used for abstract theory, was now being applied to a purpose that felt profoundly superstitious. He wasn't just building a machine, he was performing a ritual, following ancient instructions to summon something unknown. He was becoming the first priest of a new, terrifying technological religion. Weeks into the build, a flicker of the old Kalen, the one who craved peer review and validation, resurfaced. He needed someone else to see it. He needed to prove he wasn't insane. He cornered his former mentor, Dr. Aris Thorne, after a guest lecture on cosmological constants. Thorne was a titan in the field, a man whose pragmatism was so rigid it had become a form of dogma. Dr. Thorne, Kalen began, his voice breathless with a manic energy. He held out his tablet, the impossible schematic glowing on the screen. My algorithm, it worked. It's not a message, it's a design. Look. Thorne, a man in his 60s with an air of condescending authority, barely glanced at the screen. He let out a short, dismissive scoff. Ah, Kalen, still chasing ghosts. He looked at the schematic for a second longer, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. It's a beautiful expression of a recursive error, my boy. A data-based inkblot test. Your algorithm is chasing its own tail and producing these lovely, meaningless patterns. You're seeing what you want to see. No, Kalen insisted, his voice cracking. The annotations, the constants at S too precise. Thorne placed a heavy hand on Kalen's shoulder, his grip feeling less like reassurance and more like an anchor. Publish the algorithm, Kalen, not the fantasy. Don't throw your career away on a pretty picture. He gave a final, patronizing pat and walked away, joining a crowd of adoring graduate students, leaving Kalen standing alone in the cavernous hall, the glow of the tablet feeling less like a revelation and more like the proof of his own delusion. The last bridge to the world of orthodox science had been burned. He was truly on his own. The dismissal only hardened his resolve. Back in his apartment, under the singular focus of his desk lamp, the device was nearly complete. It sat on his workbench, a bizarre chimera of old and new technology. Gleaming copper coils wrapped around a core of milky quartz, connected by scavenged wires to the impossible 3D printed components that seemed to absorb the light. It was time to fit the final piece. A small, intricate node that was meant to link the power source to the quartz core, but it wouldn't connect. He pushed, he twisted, he checked the blueprint a dozen times. The connection point seemed right, but the components simply wouldn't fit. He was exhausted, his hands shaking from caffeine and lack of sleep. Frustration mounted, hot and suffocating. He was on the verge of giving up, of hurling the entire contraption against the wall. He slumped back in his chair, defeated, and just stared at the schematic on his tablet. He wasn't looking as an engineer anymore, but as a beaten man. And in that moment of surrender, he saw it. The line indicating the connection wasn't a straight, logical vector. It was a curve, a subtle, elegant arc that followed the golden ratio. A logarithmic spiral. It was a design choice born of aesthetics, of artistry, not of engineering. It was an intuitive leap, encoded in the data. He picked up the component again, his frustration replaced by a sudden, reverent understanding. He didn't try to force it. He guided it along the invisible curve he now saw in his mind's eye. With a soft, satisfying snap, the piece slid perfectly into place. It was finished. He stared at the completed device. It was smaller than he'd imagined, and strangely simple. It looked less like a piece of advanced alien technology, and more like a piece of abstract sculpture. It sat on his workbench, inert and silent. With a surge of adrenaline, Kalen connected it to a stabilized power source. He plugged a set of studio-grade headphones into the output jack. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it. the culmination of his life's work, the answer to the 48-year-old question. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his hand hovering over the power switch. He flicked it, and nothing happened. No lights, no sound, no energy reading on his instruments. The headphones delivered only a perfect, mocking silence. He waited. 1 second, 10, a full minute. Nothing. His face, which had been tight with anticipation, fell. The hope that had fueled him for weeks drained away, leaving a hollow, crushing emptiness. He tore the headphones from his head as if they were burning him. He frantically checked the connections, his hands trembling with a new, desperate energy. Everything was secure. Everything was as the blueprint demanded. But the machine was dead. The project was a bust. The universe remained silent, cold, and rational. The mini-climax of his grand quest was the profound, suffocating anticlimax of absolute failure. The camera of his life lingered on his crushed expression, a man who had sacrificed everything for a ghost, only to find himself completely and utterly alone. The silence was the sound of his failure. It was a dense, heavy presence in the small apartment, more deafening than any noise. Elias Vance sat motionless in his chair, a statue of defeat amidst a sea of discarded components and scrawled upon papers. His creation, the culmination of his life as singular obsession, sat inert on the workbench, a monument to his own grand delusion. Thornous words echoed in the crushing silence, a fantasy. The night had bled away, and the first hint of dawn painted the window a bruised purple. Kalen didn't notice. He was lost in a grey, featureless landscape of failure. He had been so sure. The math was elegant, the design was perfect. His methodical, scientific process had been flawless, and it had produced a dead object. The universe, it seemed, did not reward faith, even faith backed by data. A single, defiant ray of morning sunlight pierced the gloom of the apartment. It cut across the room and struck the milky quartz crystal at the heart of the device. For a moment, the crystal glowed with a soft, internal fire. And in that fleeting illumination, Kalen saw something. A flaw, not in the crystal itself, but on its surface. An imperfection so small, so faint, that it was invisible under the harsh, direct glare of his desk lamp. He leaned forward, his heart giving a painful lurch. It wasn't a scratch. It was an etching, a microscopic diagram, precise and deliberate, etched onto the crystal's facet. He grabbed a magnifying glass, his hand trembling. It was a wave function diagram, an annotation he had missed completely, and with it, a cascade of realization that hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been a fool. He had been trying to power it like a light bulb, trying to listen to it like a radio. His error was one of scale, of fundamental misunderstanding. The diagram wasn't about input or output. It was about resonance. The device didn't need power. It needed attunement. It was designed to resonate like a perfectly shaped tuning fork with a specific, incredibly faint frequency. A frequency hidden not in local space, but deep within the oldest light in the universe. The cosmic microwave background, the faint residual echo of the Big Bang itself. The solution, the key to unlocking the entire puzzle, had been there all along, revealed not by brute calculation, but by a quiet moment of observation. The quest was not over. It had just truly begun. Hope, fierce and sharp, banished the despair, but his apartment was no longer sufficient. He needed a bigger instrument. He needed an ear that could listen to the dawn of time. That night, Kalen became a trespasser. He slipped through the broken fence surrounding the university's decommissioned radio observatory. The facility was a relic, a great steel dish pointed at the sky like the fossilized ear of a dead god. The control room was a time capsule from the 1980s, smelling of dust and ozone. The massive consoles were dark, but Kalen knew they still had a connection to the dish. He worked with a quiet, frantic energy, a ghost in the machine. He connected his small, strange device to the massive, ancient hardware. The contrast was stark. His elegantly bizarre creation, a node of alien thought, plugged into the rusting analog heart of old-school science. The room was utterly dark, lit only by the faint, ghostly glow of a single monitor he'd managed to power on. It displayed a familiar, mesmerizing pattern, the static of the cosmic microwave background. The snow on the screen was the oldest story ever told. With his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs, he put on the headphones. The familiar hiss of the CMB filled his ears, the sound of the universe breathing. He took a steadying breath and began the calibration, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard, feeding the attunement data from the crystals etching into the observatory's controls. He was tuning the 100-ton steel dish as if it were a simple guitar, aiming it at a specific coordinate in space and time. He adjusted the final parameter. The hiss in his ears shifted, the texture of the static changing subtly, becoming finer, smoother. He was close. He was tuning out the entire known observable universe to listen for a single whisper hidden beneath it all. He made the final, infinitesimal adjustment, locking the frequency. The static ceased. It was replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt like the pressure in his ears had dropped. It was the sound of a vacuum, the sound of nothing. For a horrifying second, he thought he had simply broken the ancient equipment. And then it began. A low hum, so quiet it was more of a feeling than a sound. It vibrated directly in the center of his skull. With the hum came a single, coherent thought, a thought that was distinctly, utterly not his own. Listen. The hum grew, blossoming into a whisper. Then the whisper became a chorus, and the chorus became a torrent. It was a psychic broadcast, a Niagara Falls of pure information crashing directly into his consciousness. He was flooded with raw, untranslatable emotion, the cold, patient joy of a nebula birthing a star, the searing agony of a civilization watching its sun die. He saw geometries that twisted his perception of space, colors his eyes were not equipped to see. He felt the collective, simultaneous consciousness of a billion worlds, a billion species, a billion years of history, all flowing through him, a single, insignificant data point in a vast galactic mind. The sensory overload was a physical agony. His human brain, his fragile synaptic network, was being torn apart by the sheer scale of the input. A hot, wet trickle ran from his nose. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the psychic hurricane raging in his head. With a final, convulsive effort, he tore the headphones from his ears and threw them across the room. Released from the signal, a raw, animal scream ripped from his throat. He collapsed to the cold, concrete floor, his body shaking uncontrollably, the ghost light of dying stars still flashing behind his eyelids. He had done it. He had found the signal. And the truth was a nightmare beyond his wildest comprehension. The man who stumbled out of the radio observatory was not the same one who had broken in. The ghost of Elias Vance, the obsessive but hopeful scientist, was gone, burned away by the raw, unfiltered consciousness of the cosmos. The man who returned to his apartment was a survivor, a castaway washed up on the shore of a terrible new reality. Days later, his apartment reflected his shattered state of mind. The walls, once bare, were now covered in thick, grey, sound-dampening foam panels. He was trying to build a fortress against the echo in his own skull. He was pale, his eyes wide and perpetually anxious, jumping at the slightest sound from the world outside his door. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost and was terrified it might find him again. The device sat on his table, no longer a scientific instrument, but an artifact of immense power and dread. It was a loaded gun, a direct line to the heart of the abyss. He had thought of destroying it, of smashing it to pieces and scattering the components. But he couldn't. The scientist in him, though battered and terrified, was still alive. He had to understand. His new methodology was born of terror and necessity. He would use the device, but only in short, controlled bursts, 1 second at a time. He would put on the headphones, brace himself, and flick the switch for a single, fleeting moment. Each time, a jolt of alien thought would flash through his mind, the crisp mathematical logic of a crystalline life form, the snarling, predatory hunger of something that lived in the dark between galaxies. After each exposure, he would collapse, shaking, and frantically document the experience in a journal. His neat, scientific handwriting had devolved into a desperate scrawl. He attempted to categorize the uncategorizable. Emotion state, aggression, predatory. Visuals, jagged, red, fractal. Emotion state, coordination, collective. Sensation, like being a single cell in a larger body. He was no longer just a scientist. He was an unwilling explorer of an inner psychic cosmos, mapping the shores of a reality that was never meant for human minds. His rational mind, his last anchor in a sea of madness, fought to find a pattern. He turned one entire wall of his apartment into a massive digital display, a web of interconnected data. On the left side, he plotted the historical fluctuations of the cosmic microwave background, which he could now interpret not as random noise, but as shifts in the tone and tenor of the great galactic mind. On the right, he projected a detailed timeline of human history. He began to cross-reference. The connections, when they appeared, were more horrifying than the raw psychic data itself. He found a sudden, violent spike in the signal's aggression frequency, a wave of psychic rage that rippled through the background radiation. The date of the spike, June 28, 1914, the day of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, the single spark that ignited the bonfire of World War I. He kept digging, his blood turning to ice. He found a powerful surge in the coordination frequency, a pulse of unified, systemic thought that began in the early 1990s and grew exponentially. It mapped perfectly to the sudden, explosive, and inexplicably synchronous growth of the internet, as if millions of human minds were suddenly guided to build the same global network. He found a long, slow wave of what his journal could only describe as melancholy, a deep, cosmic sadness that washed over the Earth for a decade. It corresponded with a statistically impossible rash of suicides among the world's most brilliant artists, poets, and musicians. He pushed his chair back from the screen, a low, strangled sound escaping his lips. It wasn't random. It wasn't a passive consciousness. It was a puppeteer, a farmer, tending to its livestock. He whispered the horrifying truth to the empty, silent room. It's not just a consciousness, it's an influence. It's been shaping us. The theory was monstrous, unthinkable, and as a scientist, he knew it was unfalsifiable. He couldn't approve it, not on a human scale. He needed a smaller system, a controlled experiment. His eyes fell on a terrarium in the corner of his room, an old hobby from a saner time. Inside was a colony of black ants, a chaotic, disorganized scramble of tiny individuals. It was the perfect test bed. With trembling hands, he began to modify his device. He was no longer just a receiver. He was learning to broadcast. He jury-rigged a small directional emitter, capable of focusing a tiny sliver of the signal. He recorded a 1-second burst of the coordination frequency, the same one that had built the internet, and loaded it into the emitter's buffer. He stood before the terrarium, the emitter aimed at the chaotic colony. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his finger hovering over the activation key. This was the moment of ultimate transgression. He was about to do to them what the cosmic mind was doing to humanity. He pressed the key. For a second, nothing happened. The ants continued their frantic, random scuttling. And then, as one, they stopped. Every single ant in the colony froze in place. The chaos vanished, replaced by a perfect, terrifying stillness. Then, in absolute, preternatural unison, they turned. They began to march, not randomly, but in a precise, coordinated pattern. They moved with the chilling grace of a single organism, their tiny bodies forming a perfect, swirling spiral on the sand, a living, breathing replica of a spiral galaxy. Kalen stumbled backward, his hand clamped over his mouth to stifle a scream. The horror was no longer theoretical. It was real. It was in his apartment. He had his proof, written in the language of marching ants, and in his quest for truth, he had become a monster, a manipulator, a god in a glass box. He now understood the signal, and he had just used it. The ant colony remained a perfect, swirling galaxy, a silent testament to Kalen's horrifying success. He stood frozen before it, the directional emitter still humming faintly in his hand. He had proven his theory. He had wielded the power of a god, and in doing so, he understood the true, crushing weight of his discovery. This wasn't a force to be fought. How do you fight the background radiation of the universe? It wasn't a truth to be revealed. How do you tell 7 billion people that their free will is a comforting illusion, a statistical anomaly in the grand cosmic equation? To do so would be to unleash a wave of madness and despair that would shatter civilization far more effectively than any war. His options had narrowed to a single terrifying point. He was a prisoner, locked in a cell whose walls were the edges of his own knowledge. He turned away from the ants and looked at the blueprint, still glowing on his wall screen. It had been a message, a trap, a key. Now, it had to be something else. It had to be a weapon, not of attack, but of defense. His mind, sharpened by terror and adrenaline, began deconstructing the designer's logic, running it in reverse. He wasn't looking for how it worked, but for its inherent weaknesses, its logical contradictions. Every system, he reasoned, contains the seeds of its own undoing. Every signal has a noise cancellation protocol, he whispered, the words a frantic prayer to the laws of physics. Every wave has a counterwave. He found it buried deep within the schematic's most complex layers. It wasn't a separate design, but an inverse function of the receiver itself, a way to generate a resonant frequency that was perfectly out of phase with the broadcast. It wouldn't block the signal, but it would create a localized field of destructive interference, a bubble of psychic silence, a shield. The goal was no longer to listen. The goal was to become deaf. He worked with a speed he didn't know he possessed. There was no time to order new parts. He began cannibalizing his own creation, the receiver device that had been the focus of his entire life. He tore apart the strange lattice of copper and quartz, his hands moving with frantic precision. This was a race, and he was beginning to suspect he wasn't alone on the track. As he worked, the very air in the apartment grew heavy, thick with a palpable pressure that pushed in on him from all sides. The background psychic noise, which he had grown accustomed to as a faint, ignorable hum, was getting louder, and it was becoming personal. Whispers, insidious and seductive, snaked into the quiet corners of his mind. They weren't loud, but they spoke with his own voice, twisting his own deepest, most secret ambitions. You proved them wrong, Kalen. Thorn. All of them. You could be a god. Show them the truth. They'll worship you. He gritted his teeth, trying to focus on the intricate soldering before him. The whisper grew more insistent. They are puppets, Kalen. But you could hold the strings. He squeezed his eyes shut, a sharp pain lancing behind them. A hot trickle of blood ran from his nose, spattering onto the circuit board. The consciousness knew what he was doing. It sensed his defiance, and it was fighting back, not with force, but with the poison of temptation, targeting the ego he thought he had long since suppressed. He ignored the whispers, his scientific pragmatism becoming a shield of its own. His focus narrowed to the purely physical task at hand. He reached for the final component. The original device had used a small, milky quartz. The shield required something different, a larger crystal, perfectly clear, to serve as the focal point for the interference wave. As his fingers brushed against its cold, smooth surface, the psychic assault peaked, exploding in his mind. The room, the world, dissolved. He was standing on a stage in Stockholm, the Nobel Prize in his hand. The applause was deafening. Dr. Thorne was in the front row, his face a mask of humiliated awe. He was a hero, a savior, the greatest mind in human history. The vision was intoxicating, a perfect balm for every scar of doubt and ridicule he had ever endured. Then, with a sickening lurch, the vision shifted. He was on the floor of his own apartment, his body cold and still. He was looking down at his own dead face, his eyes wide with terror. The cause of death, a simple brutal aneurysm caused by the unbearable strain. He would die alone, his secret dying with him, a forgotten footnote in a controlled history. He cried out, a raw, wounded sound, caught in the crossfire between visions of ultimate glory and ultimate failure. The consciousness was showing him his two fates, his heaven and his hell, trying to paralyze him with ambition and fear. But in that final, critical moment, a third option rose within him: defiance. With a guttural yell that was pure, unthinking will, he rejected both fates. He rejected the lure of the god and the terror of the ghost. He grabbed the clear quartz crystal and, ignoring the searing pain in his head, slammed it into its housing. He scrambled for the power switch, his visions swimming, the psychic screams reaching a crescendo. He threw the final switch. A low hum emanated from the newly born shielding device. And then, perfect, absolute, beautiful silence filled his mind. The pressure vanished. The whispers were gone. The cosmic background noise ceased. For the first time since he'd stepped into the observatory, his thoughts were entirely, completely his own. He gasped, breathing in the silence like a drowning man breathing air. Exhausted, he stumbled to his window and looked out at the city below. The streams of cars, the lights in a million windows, the people moving in their intricate, unknowable patterns. It was all the same as it had been before, but now he saw it with terrible clarity. He could no longer hear the music that made them move, but he could see the dance. The final shot of his life, had anyone been there to see it, was of his face, illuminated by the city lights. It was a mask of profound, agonizing triumph, the face of a man who had won a war for his own soul, only to find himself the sole, lonely inhabitant of a silent, one-man world. He was the guardian of a truth he could never share, a warden of a freedom he was the only one to possess. He was finally, terrifyingly, free. What a journey Elias Vance takes us on. It starts in a place of pure science, with a man so dedicated to data that his belief in his own algorithm feels like a kind of faith. He's chasing a ghost in the machine, looking for an answer from the stars that he can quantify and prove. But the story pulls off a fascinating reversal. The deeper Kalen goes into the science, the more superstitious his world becomes. His quest for a logical message uncovers what feels like a cosmic curse. His meticulous construction of the device, based on the blueprint, is less like engineering and more like performing a ritual to summon something ancient. What is so compelling here is that science doesn't debunk the superstitious idea that we are influenced by unseen forces. Instead, it proves it. The story suggests that maybe our myths about fate, divine influence, or even possession weren't entirely wrong, they were just missing the data. Kalen uses the tools of reason to arrive at a terrifying, mystical truth. In the end, he isn't a triumphant hero who saves the world. He is a lonely survivor who can only save himself, creating a small pocket of silence in a universe filled with noise. And it leaves us with a heavy question. If you discovered a terrible truth that the world wasn't ready to hear, would you share it? Or would you carry the burden of that knowledge alone?